So while at Gamescom at the RTX event, we at Digital Foundry saw a lot of demos covering upcoming games with ray tracing integration running on NVIDIA RTX 2000 series GPUs. Although the time was short and we didn't get to see everything directly, we did get some wonderful B-roll footage, and we also talked to 4A Games rendering engineer Ben Archer to get some more details and impressions about how the studio looks to utilize ray tracing, both in Metro Exodus, as you can see here, and possibly in the future for other games. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, John Linneman. How you doing there, John?
I'm doing pretty good, Alex. I'm certainly ready to discuss Metro.
Oh, of course. I'm always ready.
Indeed. Let's go.
So to get right into the thick of it right away, we already knew from basically back in the March-April time period when DXR was originally announced that this game would be using, or at least just by looking at the video itself, that it was going to be using it for global illumination, ray tracing for global illumination. And in discussing with Ben Archer exactly what they're doing, we know right off the bat that the game's using ray tracing here for diffuse global illumination, and that includes a first bounce of sorts, so a colored bounce from light hitting a surface from the sun, moon, or sky, and as well as fallout from that, a sort of indirect ambient occlusion kind of look from things. It's different because it's not just kind of applied on top of the lighting, but it's from the lighting itself. So there is a combination here of diffuse global illumination and ambient occlusion from the ray tracing itself. And the reason why they chose it for this game is they investigated a number of routes before they started actually integrating it at the beginning of this year, and they decided, since their game spends so much time outdoors and there's not a lot of artificial lighting, and really only at night, that they would get the best bang for their buck in terms of performance and looks by utilizing it for diffuse global illumination and ambient occlusion like we see here. And I really think they made a great choice for their art style of their game. How do you feel about that, John? Basically, given what you played at a different build, a non-RTX enabled build, do you feel like they made the right choice for diffuse GI in this game?
Well, certainly. I think we're still at the phase where RTX is going to be expensive enough, even on these high-end cards, that developers have to make a choice. You can't do everything using RT at the moment. So for a game like this, with its very sort of moody, dusty look, this is the perfect choice, especially for these sort of like these sequences here. Like you see the light entering these old rundown shacks, and you get that first bounce. I think that is one of the things that makes it feel the most moody, so to speak, because it's sort of a dark and sinister game like previous Metro titles, but this one, with the lack of electric lights strewn about everywhere, you only really need to worry about the sun. And what makes this so interesting, I think, in the case of a game like this is, while they do use light probes and such already when you're not running RT, or on the console versions as well, this is a game with a dynamic time of day system, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's what makes this such an interesting solution, because now you actually do not need to pre-compute the way the lighting interacts with the different building structures. So as the sun rises and sets and the moon comes out, that's going to directly influence the way a room looks. Yeah, I was pretty impressed with what they had to show here, and I did actually play quite a bit of the game on a normal PC, and I think this is where the next thing I want to discuss actually is the performance cost, right? Because a lot of people are looking at this and thinking, that's cool, but I don't want to sacrifice my frame rate. But
I think you can see just in the footage here, though, there's sections where it's going through this specific B-roll that we have here of them turning on and off RTX. You can see that it does have a frame rate influence, basically, as soon as they turn it on.
Yeah.
We also have some frame metrics here, but I wouldn't take them to completely to heart at the moment, because we're, one, talking about indirect footage, and two, it's an implementation in the making. There's a lot of optimization that they probably still have to do for the game itself, which is already really heavy, as John will talk about.
Yeah, so that's the thing here we need to keep in mind. This is not just in progress for RTX. The game itself is still in development.
Yeah.
And it's very heavy, as you say. So the computer I played it on at Gamescom this year, and I spent about 40 minutes with it, it was equipped with a high-end Ryzen CPU, so maybe not the ultimate CPU here, but it was also paired with a Titan XP.
Yeah.
So prior to these new cards, it's pretty much the fastest card out there. They were running it at reasonably high settings, possibly the highest. That's kind of what they indicated, but they asked us not to go into the options menu because, it would crash. So we didn't, just trying to be cool with them. But needless to say, the performance was not good at all yet.
Yeah.
And again, we were at native 4K on a 4K monitor. This is 1080p, sure, but at 4K on a Titan XP, the frame rate was almost always under 60 and sometimes under 30.
Yeah, it's unsurprising for a 4A developed game, I would say, even in development, because
exactly.
You look at their games beforehand, either the way the original Metro 2033 looked like on console versus the way it looked on PC, all the extra graphical features that they enable essentially just on the PC version of the game, and assuming that your demo configuration was utilizing graphic effects that are probably just really heavy in general, perhaps like extremely high resolution shadow maps, maybe extra things like screen space shadows that the console versions may not have. It's just a heavy game in general. So them adding then RTX on top of a game that is already developed with the latest rendering techniques in mind, and ones that with high precision on PC presumably, this running the way it does, like we see in the demo where it's at 1080p here and dipping below 60 FPS, I don't think it's wholly surprising necessarily.
That's true, and I think again they did say that they're targeting a solid 60 FPS at this resolution when the final game hits, and I'd also expect the regular non-RT enhanced version to run significantly better as well by the time they launch. But I think what this has all made me think about more is the DLSS, right? So the deep learning super sampling.
Yes. Yeah.
We haven't seen a lot of great examples of this in motion yet, so there's still questions to be answered, but essentially to me it seems like it's their take on reconstruction, building an image that appears higher resolution while technically rendering at a lower resolution as a base, and then interpolating from that, or not necessarily interpolation, but building the image from that.
Yeah, they say inferencing in their documentation. Inferencing. Yeah, which is lovely.
So I think that is a key technology to making ray tracing usable in these games. If you're going to be stuck at 1080p and DLSS allows you to effectively reach what looks visually like a higher resolution, that might help obfuscate the problem, because it's true, PC gamers and myself don't really want to go back to this 1080p, right?
Yeah, I know. As someone who loves this RT technology, the difference between a 4K image and a 1080p one is not one to scoff at. I think it's gonna look different,
right?
And since it's not something so, I would say it's immediately directly obvious when you look at the game scenes like you're seeing here when they turn it on and off. I think it is immediately directly obvious, especially in those areas where light is streaming in from a specific direction, and a normal light probe can capture the general ambience, but it cannot capture the fact that it's coming from a direction itself. So you get a bounce from very specific direction. And there's a couple of other things that I really think we need to talk about more here.
Sure.
So obviously using ray tracing for something like diffuse GI is expensive, and we can see that in the footage that we're seeing here. But diffuse GI through ray tracing can do a number of things that other representations like through voxels could not capture. Like in the number of scenes here, you can see extremely small bounces or extremely small indirect shadows that something like a voxel representation through VXAO or VXGI that we've seen in other games couldn't ever possibly capture. Like behind this bookshelf here, you can see a global illumination bounce, or at the bottom of this chair, how it has like a GI bounce on it just on the lower rim. These things are something that only could be really captured through ray tracing itself.
Exactly.
But even though it's expensive, they are still optimizing it as we speak.
Yeah, and also they did mention that there's little hacks here and there. For instance, the BVH structure isn't going to be fine enough to handle individual leaves and foliage, like alpha effects. Like,
yeah, exactly.
You see all the little pine needles in there, the grass blades. They're not running with that. Not even necessary, honestly.
Yeah, they're not running RT through that. That would be absurd. In this demo we saw here, they already had a couple of optimizations in. There's 3 rays being shot or sampled per pixel at the moment, but they still jitter them over time, giving them one another kind of extra bounce look to them, and to make them more stable, because 3 pixels is still not enough for perfect convergence on the scene.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're like staggering the update of things that are closer to the camera.
And I think they said that would be defined by distance from camera as well. So like a really distant enemy, they would maybe update every, 3, 4, 5 frames.
Yeah, exactly. And things like that. So like a skinned mesh, which represented by like a character or a monster in this game, in the background wouldn't have its kind of ray traced representation updated in the background. It's completely unnecessary.
Exactly.
But there's still a lot that they need to be doing essentially in the future, because as they mentioned in our interview, they're currently, or at least they wouldn't give a definitive answer on it, they're not using the Turing's architecture's tensor cores for denoising the raw ray traced results at the moment. They did mention using temporal data, like we just talked about, but they wouldn't exactly talk about using tensor cores. So I'm curious to see what kind of quality or performance improvements we can get in the future for ray tracing like this just by utilizing the tensor cores, because at the moment the quality is pretty great, but it's expensive. But if we could perhaps push the initial kind of like cost lower and using tensor cores to up-res the ray tracing, kind of like DLSS is doing, that would be something that would be interesting to see, but they wouldn't really go further into detail there, unfortunately, in our interview.
And yeah, they're still, like you said, they're still figuring things out. They haven't had access to these cards for long enough to really understand what they're capable of.
Yeah.
And this is all first generation stuff, and because it's such a dramatic shift in the way rendering's handled, naturally it's going to take developers time to figure out best practices and how to best put this stuff to use without, destroying the performance budget. Because, essentially it's just about how you saturate the RT core, which itself is just kind of a black box. They're just going to input the data, you get data back. It's just about how much can you throw at this thing without slowing down the rest of the pipeline.
Yeah, exactly. Moving over, though, from the direct rendering of ray tracing here, John also did have a chance to play it for a long time, 40 minutes or so, on a non-RTX enabled build. And John, do you think when looking at what you played, can you imagine ray tracing and affecting the gameplay as much?
Well, I'm not so sure that ray tracing is going to impact the gameplay, because they have to design it without ray tracing in mind, right? Like this is still an addition rather than like the core focus. So technically speaking, the game it has to be playable without RT. But what really took me by surprise, I guess, or more like, I guess it lived up to the expectations I had for it, is that the game itself seems to have changed from the previous Metros in a pretty dramatic fashion, right? Mm-hmm. So Metro 2033 and its sequel were both very linear action games, right? You're moving through a lot of underground tunnels, occasionally going above the surface, but it was essentially as linear as something like a Half-Life.
Definitely.
So I don't know how large the world's going to be, but in the demo, it was large but constrained in a way that I liked. And I think the best comparison point for me is the original Crysis, where you're presented with a clear objective and direction, but you have a variety of tools, and the path itself is extremely wide. So you're making your way to these points, but there's many ways to get there. And the way you encounter the enemies, and the mix of stealth or shooting, and there's a lot of customization options on your gear. It even has the whole thing where you pull your weapon up Crysis style to customize aspects of it.
I always love that.
And there's enemy AI patrolling the area. They're not immediately aware of your presence. You can get the drop on them. Just a lot of cool animation work that I appreciate as well. Like, there was a point where you get ambushed by these three guys that drop out of a tree. They made it so that as each one came down, they kind of grabbed on or pushed down on a branch, and the branch would come down with their body and then snap back up, and you'd see leaves going flying everywhere in the air.
Oh, that's awesome.
And they did it 3 times for those enemies to drop out of the different trees, and it just looked phenomenal in action. And honestly, the action itself just felt much tighter, I feel, than the previous Metro games.
Yeah, that's something that they've kind of been refining from game to game, kind of getting that shooting feeling better with each iteration of the engine. Yeah, I like that.
But I'm just excited to see what they can do. I'm sure this is going to look great on consoles. We've seen it on Xbox One X. It looks awesome there.
Yeah, 30 and 4K looks great.
4A is no stranger to pushing PC technology in new directions, possibly second only to classic Crytek. At the time, Metro 2033 came out, maybe some things were less efficient than they could have been, but they were pushing some really new, cool new techniques at the time that really showcased what you could do with a powerful PC. I think we're seeing that here again.
Yeah, I think that's really how we have to view RT at the moment, especially in this game. It's going to be an extra thing you can turn on. They're not designing the game around it, like you just said, for gameplay.
Right.
It'll just make it look that much more realistic and better and dynamic, obviously, with the dynamic time of day that the game has. You can read online about people kind of getting upset about the performance considerations that it'll have, but just view it as something for the future. But I think that's really enough for that we can talk about RT in this game at the moment for right now until we get our hands on it at the beginning of next year. And really, until then, I hope you enjoyed this conversation John and I have had about the ray tracing implementation in Metro Exodus. And if you did like this video, hit that like button or subscribe to the channel. But if you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell button in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to talk to John or I about Metro Exodus or ray tracing in general, follow us on Twitter or write a comment below. In the meantime though, this is Alex and John,
signing off.